Tom and I are excited to share our ideas today on how to unlock the power of consumers. What we're really hoping to do is inspire you to think differently about the people we collaborate with, and we're hoping it generates some new ideas for you that you can use in your roles. So our starting point is actually looking back, a bit of a look at the history of market research over the last 15 years. And what we observe is that market research has changed substantially. In the last 15 years, we've gone from a very passive, simply listening to consumers, to a far more active two-way engagement and interaction. Now, all of this has been triggered by the evolution of technology, most notably social media. And I would argue it's now well understood that collaborating with consumers is essential to drive brands forward in an evidence-based way. So I think at this stage, everyone's just saying, of course, we know this and nodding in agreement. But we see still a couple of challenges. And first of all, one challenge is that we still treat people all the same in our collaboration initiatives. Instead of looking for the different skills and the powers that people have, we see all consumers, all people that we collaborate with as validators. And secondly, we also see that often the feedback that we get from people in our research is limited to asking only for occasional feedback, occasional validation. Now, we believe we can do better. And to understand how we can do better, we introduce the 90-9-1 framework of brand consumer collaboration. Now, if this concept of 99 and 1 sounds familiar, that's because the original formulation of the idea was actually put forward in a different context by Bradley Horowitz from Google, who observed on social media that we see that 90% of members simply consume content without creating, 9% liked or shared content, and 1% create the content on these networks. Now, this sort of rule has become a general principle for all online communities. It's been observed in multiple different contexts. Now, as a consumer collaboration agency, we observe a similar 99-1 rule, but in our case, in the context of consumer brand interactions. Our experience shows us that the significant majority, around 90%, of people like to just share feedback and validate. About 9% are extremely passionate and can curate, and only 1% are truly innovative and creative. In the rest of the presentation, we'll show you how we can get value from moving from this unidimensional perspective, seeing all consumers, all people as the same, just validating, to a much more multidimensional perspective that uses the entire skill set of consumers. So let's look at the power of each of these groups, and starting with the everyday consumers. As you'll see, this segment has a significant role to play in a consumer-centric business. And that is because every day, these people that we call everyday consumers are really experts by experience, because every single day we consume brands and products from the moment we get up in the morning until we go to sleep at night. And over a lifetime, many of us build up significant experience with brands and product categories, often even a lot more than the managers of these brands. So even though we see people having a lot of experience with brands, we also face a challenge, which is that if we look at the success rate of new product development initiatives, we know that 40 to 90% of new products actually fail. So it's clear that we're not always successful by taking the perspective of these experts by experience on board. So the question is really, why is it so hard to take the perspective of everyday people? Well, we see at least two reasons for this. And this is the first one, that today we focus a lot more on marketing to consumers, where we should be focusing on mattering to people. I mean, even the word consumer is to some people offensive. Of course, we use it in a very particular context, but it's really about immersing ourselves as insights people, as marketers, as brands, into the lives of people we want to connect with, and doing so in far more structural ways. So there's a very interesting Japanese concept called Gemba, which encapsulates this approach. Gemba means the real place, or the place where the action happens. And now this is the challenge we are laying down for marketers and insights professionals, to go to that real place, to observe how consumers behave in their own context, not in ours. And we believe that online tools and connected devices like smartphones make this easier than ever before, allowing us to collaborate on a truly structural level with people in their own context in a way that is natural and convenient to them. But even if we have these insights, even if we have gone to a place of really understanding how people interact and behave and think in their own context, it's not a natural conclusion that we necessarily are able to use those insights, because often we don't have enough empathy, since you and I and all of us are not our consumers. According to a very interesting survey out of Sydney, Australia, 41% of Sydney agency people live in the inner city. This compares to just 4% of the general public. As you can imagine, as a result, they often experience a very different lifestyle, thinking about their mode of transport, their music preference, their fashion taste, than their consumers. Now, of course, this is not limited to the marketing industry in Australia, but a general trend for marketers and people everywhere. We all tend to live in our own bubbles that leave us biased to seeing things from our own and not a different point of view. So that means we might miss our mark with our target audience, often without even knowing why. So what does it look like when we actually do the things I'm talking about, when we immerse ourselves in the lives of people in a structural way that is natural to them? Here's an example of a case study from our team in Hong Kong. And as background, many brands look to engage with young consumers in Hong Kong. Nike is certainly no exception. But what we found out was this was no easy task at all. The client, Nike, has spoken to youngsters before by inviting them for a face-to-face interview, very traditional, but they found it very difficult to make them speak up and articulate their thoughts. As you can imagine, the effects of things like the Hong Kong protest movement, the practical challenges of COVID-19, it became harder and harder to get young people in Hong Kong to open up in face-to-face settings. So they came to us looking for a way to re-engage with these young consumers and build a really localized strategy, ultimately with the goal of reigniting the local sneaker culture. So this involved gaining an in-depth understanding of what defines Gen Z, their beliefs, their values, and their attitudes. Very specifically, what we did is we recruited and invited 30 young fashionistas and sneakerheads aged 18 to 24 to a 3-week online community. We put in a lot of effort to make sure that the topics we engaged them on were not just generated by us, but also that they could contribute to the topic development. We also invited them to share things that they think are important, and we allowed them to speak in their own language, not in ours. This allowed them to feel a lot more comfortable in this online environment. And the youngsters shared photos and videos of their outfit for the day, showed us their shoes and clothes, and even discussed their favorite Instagram influencers. But they also really opened up about who they are and who they want to be. Ultimately, we gathered hundreds of rich media consumer posts in merely 3 weeks, including text, photos, videos. What we ultimately saw is this approach proved very successful in reaching into the real lives of these youngsters. And of course, this also informed the strategy for Nike. Now, that's an example of the impact for a client, but it's really not just about creating value for clients, but also about creating an enjoyable experience for consumers. As this quote from one of our Square community shows, this person speaks about having an enjoyable experience and the fact that they will miss being part of this community. So ending the chapter on the 90 or the everyday consumers, I would say that even though we call this segment the everyday consumers, it shouldn't make us think of the insights we get from them as ordinary, but in fact, far from it.
Very interesting, Henk, that your viewpoints on the everyday consumer. We call them everyday consumers, but we all know that when we want to do research with them, that it's not always that easy to find them, to find the right participants, especially in those digital projects and in communities. What, according to you, are the characteristics of a good participant when we talk about everyday consumers?
Yeah, that's such an important question, because I think we can talk a lot about the importance of engaging people in, for example, digital communities. But unless we can really hook these people and make them stay and give them something and provide value to our clients, it doesn't really mean much. So in order to understand what makes a really strong network, we actually did research on our own networks that we provide to clients, 60 different networks across 20 different countries with over 250,000 consumers over the last 5 years. We put all of this data together and we asked the question, what makes a strong and a good network? And so what we found was three interrelated ideas that came forth. It's this concept of an interesting, interested, and involved network. So I'll unpack that a little bit and say that level one is just defining who is interesting for our network. Do we need to collaborate with a specific brand's consumers, a particular demographic profile, perhaps with someone uniquely passionate about a category? But we need to start by defining this outer layer of who is interesting, since we go from everyone out there in the world to finding this first layer of the right people for our project. Level number two is then identifying amongst these interesting people, those who are interested in collaborating with us. These people show their interest to us by joining our network, and they can now be steered towards collaboration activities that are relevant to them. But we can't stop there, because level three is really the important step. And this is where we identify those who go beyond mere interest to becoming involved in the network through their contribution. And what we see is involved network members share their experiences, they curate content, and they create new things based on their skills. They don't stop at curiosity, but they truly collaborate. Now, this might sound like a very conceptual framework, but the distinction between these layers has measurable effects on network performance. What we saw across these 250,000 members in our research of these networks was that we observed 50% higher total collaboration as measured by contributions, and 75% higher retention after 1 year amongst an involved network compared to a network created with interesting and interested people only. So for me, it's involvement, this very final layer of connection, that is the most valuable, but it's also the most likely to be missing from a lot of network strategies.
Yep. Really interesting, I think, the results from your research on research that actually show that three criteria are important: interested, interesting, and then being involved or involvement. Are that also the criteria that you then use in screening when looking for the ideal everyday consumers for the projects of our clients? Do we take that into account, and how do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's very important, because if we, this is not just an exercise of saying what made things successful before, but actually what will make them successful in the future. So for all of those different steps, from interesting to interested to involved, we have very specific ways of identifying the right people. I'll mention also that in these final steps, involvement, for example, we actually check the behavior of people. It's not just a claimed questionnaire that we put forward to them, but we actually see whether people are contributing in the network. And that becomes that final layer that is so important. So this is all built into our process, all built into the screening of a network for our clients.
Yeah. We know also, Henk, that it's not only about finding participants and making sure that they get on board and they stay on board during the first days, the first weeks of such a project, but it's also about what will they do in a month from now, in a couple of months from now, maybe in a year from now. So my question would be, how do we keep those participants engaged over time, and how do we make sure that a great participant today will also be a fantastic participant tomorrow?
Yeah, another big but important challenge. I would say, in a word, relevance. The more relevant we make the collaboration, the higher the engagement over time. And when we speak of relevance, it's really acknowledging that everything we do in the collaboration is increasing or decreasing relevance for this person. So this means everything from things we can't control, like the intrinsic interest in the topic. We have very little control whether someone finds financial services interesting or whether entertainment services are more interesting to them. But there are lots that we do control. For example, the quality of the research activities, how interesting people find them, how effortful they are to complete. The rewarding, for example, is an important part. Of course, we think about the monetary side of rewarding, but there's also the intrinsic factors of being able to contribute, seeing that you're making a difference. And then the ease and enjoyment with which you can use the platform. Is it available on all different devices? Is it, for example, mobile enabled? And then I think a final thing that we also see is the first 24 hours, the first impression we make with this person once they join an experience is vitally important. So what we always focus on is making sure that once someone has joined one of these collaboration initiatives, that we provide them with a very relevant and interesting experience, and don't make the first experience something that actually churns them away from doing this for us again. So first impressions matter, and really focus on that first 24 hours.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you, Henk, for sharing your thoughts on the everyday consumer. And you will come back for the next two to answer some questions that I have, but also from the crowd, from our audience. So I would encourage everyone, when you have a question, just type it in the chat, and we will make sure that we answer your question after each of the different chapters. So now I will take you through the next chapter, which are the leading edge consumers. And leading edge consumers are not experts by experience like the everyday consumers. No, they are experts by passion. They are very much into a certain topic, and they know everything about that topic. And they're also at the forefront of things. They know what's new and next within their domain of passion. At Insights Consulting, we have a network of leading edge consumers called our Illume network. And here you see Emil, and Emil is from Warsaw, the capital of Poland, and he is one of our so-called Illume guides. He is a owner of a cocktail bar in Warsaw, and of course, he knows everything about mixology and about all kinds of beverages. And on top of that, he's also very much into the nightlife and going out scene in the capital of Poland, which is very vibrant. And he uses his passion and his knowledge to help brands, for example, beverages brands, to see actually what is new and next, and to guide them, to steer them towards the future. You could say that Emil and our Illume guides are helping brands to not get to insights like the everyday consumers, but to foresights, if you want. So what exactly is the marketing issue that leading edge consumers can help you with? Well, they can help you to solve a problem or an issue that we see quite often today in marketing, which we call marketing short-termism. And it's all about the fact that today in marketing, sometimes we focus maybe a little bit too much on the results that our brands will bring in the next quarter or in the next year. And there is too little attention for what's new and next, what we have to do tomorrow and in the day after tomorrow to still be and stay relevant for our consumers. So that is exactly what leading edge consumers can do for you. They can help you to see the future, if you want, to see what's new and next. And a nice example is the project we did for Royal Bank of Scotland. At Royal Bank of Scotland, they identified a couple of territories within the space of technology, new technologies, that in the future might have an impact on banking and how we manage our financials. And what we did is we looked for Illume guides that are actually already using those new and shiny technologies to manage their financials. So it's a little bit like in the quote, the future is already here, it's just unequally distributed. We are looking for the people that are already living that future life, that are already having those behaviors that we might see in the future. So they helped us to actually try to see what potential futures might be when it comes to the crossover between banking and technology. So These are the leading edge consumers. So Henk, I would love to have you back on the virtual stage because I think we have some questions for you. My first question would be, can you give us a couple of more examples of who those leading edge consumers are? We saw Emil, but can you give a couple of more examples? And can you make it even more concrete what it is that they can do for brands, for companies? What is the value they can bring to projects?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Happy to try and make that a bit more clear. So I think for me, there are a couple of things that stand out about this 9 or the leading edge consumers. I think, first of all, they're highly involved. And this means, for me at least, passionate and knowledgeable about a particular subject. So you had the example of Emil, who had a very particular area that he was passionate about, but it could be something completely different. And of course, depending on the client needs, we're looking for very specific topics that people are really involved in. And then that's also combined with an ability to articulate how this area of interest for them is situated within a particular cultural context. So it's not just good enough for them to be really interested in sports or a particular product category or a particular trend, but they also need to be able to verbalize how this could potentially be a big trend in the future, how this is a current emerging trend. And then often the focus of their passions are trends, like you mentioned, at the edge of what's next and new. So it offers a glimpse for us into these potential futures that brands can play a part in. In terms of their contribution, you mentioned marketing short-termism. And for me, I think that's spot on because the contribution they make to projects is really to shift us away from looking at yesterday and today and focus us more on what tomorrow could look like. And I think that's a fundamental sort of a shift away from where we currently spend a lot of time doing our research and insights projects.
Yeah, thanks, Henk. We have a question from Rose, and I think it's one that you probably hear a lot. Where do we find those leading edge consumers? How do we recruit them? How do we select them? How does that work?
So I think step number 1, like any good project, is we define exactly who we're looking for. And this becomes incredibly important for the 9 because they are so specific. So we have a team of experts in our culture and trends team that really looks after this and says, for this project, what is the kind of profile, the kind of person we're looking for? So this is really important because it's so specific. But then in terms of how we actually going to find these people, we have an existing network called the Illum Guides. You mentioned that earlier. And this is the name of the network that we have already pre-screened for these kinds of collaborations. So we have hand-picked people that fit the right kind of profile for future potential projects. And of course, it's not always the case that we'll find the right person in our network. Now, if we don't, then we need to go outside of our network, make use of the same experts that recruit these people, and handpick the right people using either referrals from current trusted members, social and digital community pages, and a host of other channels. The thing is about finding these people is from going from 90 to the 9, that's sort of divides by 10, it becomes fundamentally more difficult to find these people. And our team has built up tremendous experience about what are the best ways to find them. It doesn't mean it's easy. By definition, saying that they are only 9 out of 100, it means it's hard. But we have found ways using a combination of the Illum network and hand-picking through an expert network that we actually are able to track these people down.
Yeah, so it's really based on the expertise within our teams to handpick those people. Fantastic.
Exactly.
Yeah. Probably a question that lots of people have on their minds, and I think you already partly answered it, but I'm still gonna ask it. Are those leading edge consumers capable of predicting the future? In other words, is this the holy grail of market research?
Yeah, I know the session's being recorded, so I just absolutely want to say, for me, they can predict potential futures. I think that's the best way to put it. I think there's a quote also by Peter Drucker who said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think what the Illum guides and what these leading edge consumers provide us is an opportunity to identify an emerging trend. But that's not the end of the work for us as brands and marketers. It doesn't mean it's automatically going to become the future. it's really up to us to make sure that this spark of an emerging trend has the fuel to ignite into a full-blown trend in the future. So I'll stick with that very cautious wording and say they can predict potential futures. But of course, if they could predict the future, I guess we would be out of a job, Tom, because market research would be irrelevant, wouldn't it?
I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
We have an interesting follow-up question from Dag, who asks, well, yeah, you can maybe select a leading edge consumer today, but we have our Illume network. Are we sure that, let's say, in a year or 2 or 3 years from now, they are still leading edge? How do we measure that? How do we keep track of that? Interesting question, I think.
Yeah, very good question. So I think, like any person in a category, you change over time, and that's a completely fair observation. So we certainly don't rely on historic claimed behaviors or historic screening information. Whenever there's a new project, this is useful to go and select from this big network and hone in on a couple of people. But even after that, we would still follow up and make sure, are they still in the category? Are they still moving towards this trend that we've identified? Because you're right, it could be outdated. So the screening is not a one and done that we do at the beginning. It's actually just a way to be profiled into the community, after which we can further screen you for projects in the future, making sure it's still relevant, you're still in the category, you're still truly leading edge, because that's a very fair observation. There's almost an expiry date on some of these trends, of course.
Yeah. So it's not only selecting the right people, but it's also keeping track of them, knowing who they are and how they evolve over time in terms of their passions. Fantastic.
Exactly.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Henk.
Good.
Let's move on to the final chapter, which is all about our creative consumers. Creative consumers are the 1%ers. Creativity is definitely something that is in high demand today. Probably it has to do with the fact that we live in a world where everything almost has already been invented, and it becomes more difficult for brands to differentiate themselves from the pack when it comes to the products and the services that they create, but also the comms that they air towards their audiences. We see that creativity is in high demand. There is a study by McKinsey that actually states that creativity, together with consumer centricity and being technology led, are the characteristics that a company needs today to not only survive, but also thrive in, let's say, the 21st century. And another study by LinkedIn Learning states that creativity is the top skill that companies are looking for today when they hire talent. So it feels indeed like creativity is in high demand. And I think it's almost logic, because when we look at what creative consumers can bring to projects, it's exactly boosting the level of creativity when we try to turn the insights that we get from everyday consumers or the foresights that we get from leading edge consumers into marketing actions, in innovations, in nice campaigns. How can we leverage that into something that will truly be different, truly be innovative, and truly make a difference when it's launched onto the market? So that's exactly the value that those leading edge those creative consumers, bring to a project. And you see here Farah, and Farah is originally from the Philippines, but now she lives in New Zealand. And she is one of our creative consumers that are part of our ICA network, or network of consumers that are part of those 1% creative people. And what does she has in terms of skills? Well, she is all into DIY projects. She does a lot of those things at home, but during daytime, she is also active in the world of video games, so in the digital industry, if you want. And that are exactly, next to her cultural background, that are exactly the skills that she can bring to a project, because that is what those creative consumers will do. They will not talk about their own experiences. They will not talk about what's new and next. No, they will use their creative skills and their different cultural background than the background of the consumers that have given us the insights and the foresights. They will use those two skills, so to speak, to really help companies to think out of the box. So we could say that those creative consumers are not experts by experience or experts by passion, like the everyday consumers and the leading edge consumers. No, they are experts by a hungry mind. They want to use their creative skills to really help brands to go the extra mile when it comes to creativity. And how do we involve them in projects? Well, we organized what we call creative crowdsourcing contests. So that means that we launch on our ICA community, on our ICA platform, we launch a contest, and there is a briefing, there is a business briefing in which we talk, of course, about the insight or the foresight that we got from the everyday consumers or the leading edge consumers. And we ask them to solve the consumer issue that is described in that insight or foresight. And we ask them to help the brand to leverage the insight or the foresight. And they use their creativity, their creative skills to come up with ideas. Individually, they do that. So it's a real contest. They really compete against one another for the best ideas. And that's how we can bring in a lot of additional ideas, how we can bring a lot of out of the box ideas to the table. So it's not that internally people are not going to ideate anymore. That still happens. But in a workshop, we will add a whole bunch of ideas coming from those creative consumers. This is a nice example, I think. It's from the Coca-Cola company for their Fanta brand. And the contest was all around, can you as creative consumers come up with innovative packaging ideas that actually bring the fun that Fanta stands for as a brand to life in the packaging design. And on top of the more or less 20 ideas that were already generated internally, they brought 112 extra fresh ideas to the table, which is, I think, amazing. And you can clearly see how then in a workshop that we do with the client, there is that boost of creativity, all those new and out of the box ideas coming in that we can start to work with to eventually end up with a couple of nice concepts that we can test again among the everyday consumers. So that's how the creative consumers can really bring value to projects. So Henk, would be great to bring you back on the virtual stage for again a couple of questions.
Sure.
Let's start with a little bit of additional information on let's say the skill set of those creative consumers. We already saw Farah, very particular skills, but I can imagine that the skill set of creative consumers can be very diverse, that we have all kinds of different skills within the network, the ICA network.
Yeah, that's correct, Tom. There's actually a question also, I think, coming in the Q&A. It might be useful also for us to check some of those, but I think this links to one of those questions, and the answer is very diverse. I mean, we have people that sign up to our network, this creative network, because they do photography, graphic design, script writing, creative writing, label and package design, animation, illustration, video. And the reason why it's so diverse is because the challenges are so diverse. We can't rely on a single type of creativity. I'm not even sure there is such a thing as a single type of creativity, but the challenges that we pose to the network are very diverse, ranging from designing, for example, a new packaging for a brand, or coming up with a very creative communication strategy. And those are fundamentally different kinds of skills that we see available on the network. So we allow and we welcome people from very different backgrounds and skill sets onto our network to be able to take part.
Yeah. Follow-up question that was asked in the audience.
Yeah.
Do we see a correlation between curiosity and creativity? So are it not only very creative people, but also very curious people? Is there a link between the two?
So I think from what we tend to, I know there's a sort of academic link between curiosity and creativity. I think I've seen that before. I think what we really focus on the ICA network is not just claimed creativity, because what happens on our network, the ICA network you referred to earlier, is people would sign up, they would claim to have certain skills, but of course, at this stage, what we need to do is make sure that they actually do have the skills that are important for us to be able to drive these concepts forward. And what we actually do is we don't just look at what they've said, we look at how they then perform. So the community managers for ICA can actually, in the background, identify good and, let's say, average performance in terms of creativity. And then we can start building up this profiling of how people have performed, not just according to what they say, but according to real briefs on real clients that they've been asked to respond to. So I would say we focused a lot less, I guess, on what drives that creativity, and we focus a lot more on identifying creativity and making sure we can put that to work.
Yeah, makes sense. I've seen a question both asked by Mathilde and by Rose. ICA is in one way or another competing with ad agencies, creative agencies, or do we see that differently?
I think it's a compliment. I mean, of course, if a brand decides to take business away, for example, from agencies, that could be the case. However, I think our way of working and what we've seen as a really good sort of strategy is to involve the creative agencies on this journey, because the value of these crowdsourcing initiatives is not that it's a one size fits all. In fact, a lot of the different kinds of challenges we face are sometimes it's full end-to-end open-ended creativity. So there's a very it's not a very directional brief. It's a brief that just says we are interested in innovating in this general space for a particular client. In other cases, a lot of work, either insight work or creative work, has already gone in, and we're at a different stage of the ideation process. And there we might be a bit more directed and give the ICA Creative Network a bit more direction to say, we are working alongside the creative agency, and this is sort of the area that they can play in. And of course, I think what's very important is that at the end of a creative contest, it's not necessarily just that we always take that specific raw output from the ICA network and just input that into a concept in the market. Oftentimes the business strategy that needs to come along with that can be very useful from a creative agency as well. So there's a lot of room to play for both the ICA network and creative agencies. It doesn't need to be either or.
Yeah, great. Fantastic answer. My next question is a traditional one that I've seen passing by on in the Q&A section as well. It's again the typical one. How do we find those people, and how do we recruit them? Where can we find those 1%ers? It looks like finding the needle in a haystack.
Yeah. What we've done, so we've approached this, we've built really a network that has now got a global reputation amongst people that want to take part in these contests. It's called ICA. I'm sure a lot of you are going to Google this afterwards and take a look, and hopefully you'll see the appeal. But what we found is that there's sort of been, we've attracted people on an inbound basis who've said, well, I'm either a professional or an amateur or a semi-professional creative person in any of these categories, and I'd like to try my hand at doing one of these briefs and these creative challenges for a brand. Now, over the course of the last 10 years plus, we've managed to build up a network of those people of over 400,000 in more than 167 countries around the world. So that's no easy feat, of course. And as I said, it's not simply that we stop at the point when someone shows interest and signs up. We actually look at their real performance on contests to make sure that for everyone who's interested and thinks they have the creative ability, we actually find the ones that truly perform on the contest, and we can put them to work against client briefs.
Yeah. A question that probably everybody has on their mind now is, it's a contest. You brief those creative consumers. You share an insight or a foresight even with
Yeah.
them in a particular way. What about confidentiality? How do we manage that?
Yeah, we need to talk about confidentiality, don't we? I mean, creativity is one of those things, I think, where it's very easy to get excited about things, but we need to think about some of these things that could obviously go wrong, shouldn't we have the right things in place. I mean, confidentiality is something we have as an agreement with all of our members, all the ICA members. So what it basically says is they're not allowed to share the details about the brands that they've helped. I think we also make it very clear, if you sign up to the ICA network, what is the expectation from you and what are we providing back to you as a reward for doing this. And I think, fortunately, what we've seen from doing hundreds of different contests is that normally confidentiality isn't a problem, but of course this is covered by a confidentiality agreement in the terms and conditions which people sign up for. So that's something that's definitely covered.
Yeah, we're talking about new ideas, so we don't only need to talk about confidentiality, but we need to talk about a very specific legal aspect as well, and that's everything that has to do with intellectual property. Who owns the ideas?
So we need to distinguish between two different cases. Once we run a contest, there's a group of ideas, and then by definition, people's ideas that get selected. And then there's a group that does not get selected. People who take part, but of course, we don't select their ideas as being something that we take forward with the brand. Now, for the group that is identified as a winner or a group of winners, they hand over and they actually sign off in an agreement the IP to the brand. So this is a very straightforward transaction where they've provided something, they fully knew what this was going to be used for, and then they provide the IP to the brand to be used. In the cases where someone does not actually become one of the winners and their idea is not selected, what we do there is we allow people to retain their IP because there's no reason for us to keep that. We're not going to use it, but we don't allow them to link it back to the brand. And of course, I think the brand is completely protected because all the ideas that we want to use are part of this ring-fenced group of protected IP that gets signed over to the company.
Yeah, very clear, very clear. I have a final question on the creative consumers, and it has to do with the value that they bring. We know that it's about boosting creativity, but I can imagine that the question that everybody has on his or her mind is the ideas that those creative consumers worked on together, of course, with the innovation and marketing people internally at the company side. Do those ideas then perform better in the market when it comes to the innovations, when it comes to the comms that is pushed out? Do we see that?
Well, I think the starting point, just backing up from answering that question, is do we see that more ideas are generated? And I think that is fundamentally true. If we compare an ICA contest to a typical ideation process, either run with an agency or internally, or just someone in a team coming up with ideas, we know that we are generating more ideas. It's just simply true. More people that are generating more ideas. Now, if we look at that idea, that concept of more concepts that we get access to, amongst that set, we get generally more winners. But of course, it's up to us selecting the right concepts and executing them well. That's really the final mix. And I think it's the same story about, concept test performance, in-market performance. That same caveat applies, which is that we can screen for, we can get good ideas, but in the execution, obviously, there's still a big leap for us to make. But certainly you get more ideas than you would in a traditional process.
Yeah, and probably it's in that second part of the process that also still a creative agency or design agency can play its role. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely agree.
That was it for the creative consumers, but I have two more questions from the audience
Good.
that talk more about everyday consumers, and I also have a challenge here from Bas that I think he already has a specific project in mind. But let's first take the question from Nikki,
Yeah.
and the question there is. We often hear that famous quote, and it's one from Steve Jobs from Apple.
Yeah.
Consumers don't know what they want until you show it to them. So how do we react to that? How is it always just asking consumers what they want, or do we have other techniques?
No, and I think that's actually such a good quote and a good background for why we have this framework, because actually we fully subscribe to that. That quote really is because typically we're asking the 90, the everyday consumers with no particular skill for creativity, to come up with something that they have no intention of doing, which is a new. I mean, the Henry Ford did the same and said we just want faster horses and not a motor vehicle. So I think that same logic applies. The difference is really what we're saying is not that you cannot ask this of people, you need to ask it to the right people. That you cannot ask a creative job to the 90, just as you shouldn't expect validation from the one. The one and the creative consumer is there for, well, for one purpose in our framework at least, and that is to come up with these new and interesting ideas. So we're not relying on everyday consumers to come up with these ideas. It's in fact the one. So that quote I really like, and I think this framework definitely addresses that by having these pockets of skills that people can take part in.
Yeah, and I think also when we just look at the everyday consumers, when it's about getting to insights, we're not going to ask them what is it that you're looking for. We're going to do exactly what you've mentioned. We go to the real place. We go to the place where the action happens, and we observe what it is that they are doing. We try to get to their unmet needs, not by asking them what their unmet needs are, but by observing their lives, by immersing into their lives. And I think it's exactly that what Steve Jobs did very well too. He didn't ask consumers what they were wanting, but he was very observant, looking at consumer behavior and unmet needs. Fantastic. Another question from Malu, now that we're talking about the everyday consumers, and it's an interesting one as well, so I'm curious to hear your answer. We start with an everyday consumer, but if they are on a community for a year or even longer, are they still an everyday consumer after that period of time? It's a good one, I think.
It's a very good one. And the answer is just like I think the earlier question was, can we assume that the leading edge consumer is still a leading edge consumer after a year? This is an ongoing process. The really good thing about having a person for the year is that we can see how they evolve. If the behavior changes, if the market changes, if we have a mismatch between who we have in our online community versus the world out there, then things need to be corrected. As a general practice, we don't advocate just simply carrying the same group of people across for a year without doing top-ups and refreshes. Of course, this means getting new fresh perspectives in, making sure that people that are either new to the category or simply just new to this community are taken on board constantly. So this is an important concept. We're not just working with the same people for multiple years. There's a constant influx of new people. And by the way, that goes not just for the 90, but also for the 9 and the 1.
Yeah, so both for our networks as for the specific communities and platforms we run for clients, it's a constant kind of management, refreshment, and keeping not only participants engaged, but also keeping an eye on the fact, do we still have the people that we need, that we want, that are the best people for the job? Yeah, sounds very very logic. And then a final final question, like I've already mentioned, from Bas, and he's thinking about exploring white space in a certain category, and I think very interesting. Which of those three types of consumers do we then need? If we want to, if that's the business question?
I love the question, and I would definitely say I know we've mentioned the book zine, but please go and have a look at some case studies, and especially what I'm going to mention next, which is this concept of not, when we do a program, to see this as different skills that come together to make up the whole. I would recommend, quite honestly, focusing on all three. I think we miss out quite a lot by looking at only the one, because then creativity without validation is really just a good idea. We haven't validated that something that comes out of ICA is necessarily the case unless we have that view and the lens of the 90. Similarly, if we have a group identifying emerging trends for the 9, we need to really make sure that the 90 can validate that this is going to be a trend in the future, and potentially we can take this into a creative solution with the 1. How can we make sure that this trend is embedded? I mean, we can imagine multiple different ways in which this interplay of the 99 and the 1, literally it adds up to 100%. And I guess another sort of way of looking at the 99 and the 1 is we don't want to shortchange ourselves out of 100% of insights. We want the full story. We want all 100% to contribute. And I think the only way to really unpack the white space is to do it through collaborating with all three in the appropriate way, and potentially in a phased process over time. And I don't obviously know the specifics of that project, but I mean, there are many ways we can put these different building blocks together.
Yeah, and I think this question and your answer, Henk, is a fantastic bridge towards the wrap up of the session. Thank you, Henk, for sharing all the knowledge that you and your team have, your expertise, and all the results from the fantastic research that you and the team are doing. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
And I think from Henk's last answer, it's clear that if you want to maximally use the power of consumers, you should actually collaborate with all three types of consumers, because they each will bring something different to your project and to the table. The 90 will help you to get to insights. The 9 will bring you foresights, and the 1 will help you to leverage those into marketing actions, innovations, comms that will truly be out of the box and will make the difference in the market. So think about it. Think how you can go beyond just validating with the 90, how you can really involve them in what you're doing, how you can really collaborate with them, and also use them more in giving you feedback, getting to real insights, but especially think also about what leading edge consumers can do for you to show you what's new and next, and how creative consumers can boost the level of creativity in your organization. And as Henk already said, there is a book zine that you will be able to download after this session. There is much more detail about everything that Henk and myself shared today in the book zine. There are lots of case studies, other case studies than the ones we shared. So please download the book zine and enjoy the read, I would say. And we tried to answer all your questions, but we didn't manage. There were just too much questions. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to drop us an email or to contact Henk or myself on our social channels. And of course, we will do our very best, if it's possible, and if your name is out there, to already proactively answer the questions that are still left in the chat. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today, and we're looking forward to welcome you again at one of our future sessions. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.